Imagine opening your banking app on an ordinary morning. Your rent has already left your account. Gone the way it always goes, on the same date it always leaves. But your paycheck hasn't arrived yet. For a moment, that should feel like a problem. An overdraft. A gap. A number that shouldn't be possible yet somehow is. Except it isn't a problem at all. Because something else paid it. Pause on that for a second because it deserves more than a passing thought. Rent left. Paycheck hadn't arrived. And yet the account never dipped, never panicked, never needed you to do anything at all. That is one of the strangest days in a person's entire financial life. Not because of the amount involved. Because of what it quietly reveals about who's actually been footing the bill. Most people believe salary pays everything. And for most of their life, that belief is completely accurate. Work happens. Paycheck arrives. The paycheck leaves again, distributed across rent, groceries, bills, and whatever's left over, if anything is left over at all. This cycle repeats month after month so consistently that it starts to feel like the only possible arrangement, the only way money could ever move through a life. Until one day it isn't. That sentence sounds small. It isn't small. It marks the exact point where an assumption that held for years, maybe decades, quietly stops being true without any announcement, without any warning, simply because something else in the background finally grew large enough to take over a job that used to belong entirely to your paycheck. Here's where that shift actually begins, and it rarely begins the way people expect. It doesn't start with a number that changes your life. It starts absurdly small. $8. $23. An amount so tiny it barely covers a coffee, deposited quietly into an account by an investment that, until that exact moment, had only ever taken money in, never given any back. Tiny. Almost meaningless, if you're only looking at the number itself. And yet, psychologically, that first small deposit lands completely differently than every number that came before it. Every other figure in your financial life until now has been something you produced. Hours converted into dollars, skill converted into a paycheck, effort converted into an amount that shows up because you showed up first. This one is different. Nobody clocked in for it. Nobody negotiated it. It simply arrived, generated by money that had been sitting quietly somewhere, doing something you couldn't see, until it produced this small, strange proof that it was actually working. $8 won't change your life, but it changes something else. Something quieter and arguably more important. It proves, for the first time in a way that finally feels real instead of theoretical, that money can behave like an employee instead of a paycheck. This is the biggest lesson buried inside this entire story, and it's worth slowing down for. Before any of this begins, the pattern is simple, familiar, the only pattern most people have ever known. You work. Money arrives as a direct result of that work. Money leaves again, almost as quickly, absorbed by rent and groceries and the ordinary cost of an ordinary life. Work, arrive, leave. Work, arrive, leave. A loop that repeats itself for years, entirely dependent on you staying inside it. But once investing enters the picture, and enough time passes for it to actually mean something, that loop gains a second version running quietly alongside the first. Money leaves your hands, placed somewhere it can grow. It returns, eventually, as something more than what you originally sent out. And at some point, instead of simply returning to you, it starts replacing the work that used to be required to produce it in the first place. Money leaves. Money returns. Money starts doing your job. That's an entirely different loop than the one you grew up inside. The first loop needs you every single time without exception. The second loop needed you once to set it in motion, and now runs largely on its own, whether you're paying attention to it or not. Most people never notice the moment this second loop starts running beside the first one. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send a notification explaining what just happened. It simply shows up one ordinary month as a small deposit, $8, $23, quiet enough to almost ignore, and loud enough, if you actually stop to notice it, to mean absolutely everything. Think about what had to happen for that small deposit to exist at all. Months, maybe years, of setting money aside before you'd ever seen a single sign that any of it was working. Contributions made on faith, month after month, into an account that offered no visible proof it was doing anything except holding what you'd placed there. And then, quietly, without fanfare, that account started producing something on its own. something that had never come from your paycheck at all. That's the part worth sitting with. The $8 didn't arrive because you worked harder that month. It arrived because of every month before it, stacked one on top of another, finally producing a result independent of your labor entirely. It's proof, small but undeniable, that a second source of income now exists in your life, one that doesn't ask you to trade another hour for it. And once you've seen that proof once, you can't entirely unsee it. The paycheck illusion, the belief that salary is the only thing capable of paying your bills, quietly starts to crack, even if the crack itself is barely visible yet. Most people, when they imagine the moment their investments truly start maturing, picture something enormous. $1 million. A number so large it feels like a finish line, a threshold you cross once, dramatically, after which everything is simply different. The reality looks nothing like that. The real crossover isn't $1 million. It's 1 month's rent. It's one utility bill. It's one grocery trip, quietly covered by something other than your paycheck, for the very first time. Think about how small that actually is, compared to the number most people are waiting for. You don't need a fortune for this moment to arrive. You need your investments to grow large enough, over enough time, to produce in a single month what one ordinary bill requires. That's it. That's the entire threshold everyone assumes must be enormous, and it usually isn't. That's when the brain changes forever. Not because the amount is life-changing on its own, because it's proof, undeniable and specific, that a second income source now exists, one you didn't have to show up for. Picture it concretely. Your rent, the exact same amount it's always been, quietly absorbed by dividends and returns instead of a paycheck. Nothing about the apartment changes. Nothing about the rent changes. What changes is where the money to cover it actually came from, and that single shift rewires something most people spend their entire lives without ever experiencing. Here's the part almost nobody expects, and it's worth pausing on because it contradicts everything culture tells you wealth should feel like. No fireworks. No new car pulling into the driveway. No dramatic scene where a stranger congratulates you. No music swelling in the background the way it might in a movie about someone striking it rich. Instead, silence. A strange, unfamiliar quiet, the kind that comes from a pressure finally releasing after years of being present so consistently you'd stopped noticing it was there at all. Confidence, arriving quietly, not as excitement but as something closer to relief. Calm, settling into a part of your mind that had been running a background calculation for years, a calculation that suddenly has nothing left to calculate. Because the pressure becomes lighter. Not gone entirely, not yet, but lighter, in a way that's difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it themselves. The same rent that once required your paycheck to survive now has two sources capable of covering it. And that redundancy, invisible to anyone else, quietly changes how safe your entire life feels. This is where the story could end well. And this is exactly where, for many people, it goes wrong instead. Because the moment investments start paying a bill, an old instinct reawakens, one that's been waiting for exactly this kind of good news for years. The instinct to upgrade. A bigger apartment because now, apparently, there's room for it. A newer car because the numbers finally seem to allow it. A gradual, reasonable-sounding expansion of lifestyle, each individual decision defensible on its own. Each one quietly erasing the very gap that made this moment possible in the first place. This is lifestyle inflation, and it's one of the most dangerous mistakes hiding inside this entire story. Precisely because it never feels dangerous while it's happening. Feels like a reward. Feels earned. It feels like exactly what all those years of discipline were supposedly for. But here's what actually happens underneath the surface when this instinct takes over. Investments that had just started paying rent now get redirected toward paying for an upgraded version of that same rent, a bigger space, a fancier finish, a location that costs noticeably more. The dividend that once covered your bill in full is suddenly covering only a fraction of a larger one, and the gap you'd spent years closing quietly reopens, sometimes wider than before. Now investments are paying for ego instead of freedom. That's the sentence worth remembering, because it captures exactly what goes wrong. The money that finally started working for you gets redirected toward impressing people who were never actually keeping score, toward a version of comfort that requires more from you rather than less. Freedom, in this story, was never about the size of what you own. It was about the size of the gap between what your investments produce and what your life actually costs. Widen your lifestyle every time your investments grow, and that gap never closes, no matter how large the numbers on either side eventually become. Think of two people both experiencing the exact same crossover, both watching their investments cover a bill for the first time. One of them lets the moment sit exactly where it is, quietly redirecting whatever comes next back into growing that same gap further. The other expands to meet the new number, upgrading just enough that the relief disappears almost as quickly as it arrived. 5 years later, the first person has a gap that keeps widening on its own, requiring less and less active effort to maintain. The second person is still running the exact same race they started years earlier, just at a slightly higher altitude with a slightly nicer view, and the exact same underlying dependency on a paycheck they were supposedly trying to escape. Neither of them did anything obviously reckless. Neither of them would describe their own choices as a mistake in the moment they made them. That's what makes lifestyle inflation so difficult to notice while it's happening. It never feels like sabotage. Feels like arrival. But the entire point of that first quiet deposit, the $8, the $23, was never to fund a bigger life. It was to prove that a second engine existed at all. What you do in the years immediately afterward determines whether that engine keeps growing, or whether it simply gets absorbed into a lifestyle that grows exactly as fast as it does, forever chasing a finish line that keeps moving in step with it. So what actually separates the person whose gap keeps widening from the person whose gap quietly closes back up? It comes down to a single, subtle shift in the question being asked. Most people, the moment their investments cover a bill for the first time, think in terms of a single sentence. My investments paid rent. It's a satisfying sentence, a proud one worth remembering. But it's also, unintentionally, a finish line. It treats the moment as an achievement, complete in itself, rather than as evidence of something that could keep expanding. The wealthy mindset asks a different question entirely. Not, my investments paid rent, but what bill can they pay next? That single reframe changes everything about what happens afterward. Instead of celebrating a single victory and unconsciously stopping there, the question turns the crossover into a pattern, an ongoing target rather than a one-time accomplishment. Internet, insurance, groceries, healthcare, a phone bill. Each one, individually small, becomes the next quiet milestone, the next piece of a life that requires progressively less from your own labor to sustain itself. Every bill replaced is another piece of freedom. Not a dramatic piece. Not something you'd announce at dinner or post anywhere, or expect anyone else to notice or care about. A quiet piece, invisible from the outside, that nonetheless changes the architecture of your entire life, one small brick at a time. Think about what it would actually mean if this pattern continued, bill by bill, year by year. Rent, covered. Then insurance. Then groceries. Then healthcare, historically one of the most anxiety-inducing categories of expense in an entire household budget, quietly absorbed by something that isn't your paycheck at all. Each one removed from the list of things your labor is required to produce, until eventually very little remains that actually depends on you showing up to work. That's not the same as never working again. Plenty of people who reach this point keep working, keep building, keep showing up to jobs and projects they genuinely enjoy. The difference isn't whether they work. It's whether they have to. And that distinction, whether you have to or whether you simply choose to, is the entire difference between the two loops we talked about earlier. Work, arrive, leave, repeating forever because it must. And work, arrive, leave, existing now purely by choice, running alongside a second loop that would keep covering your life regardless of whether you participated in the first one at all. Let's bring this all the way back to where it started. The first month your investments pay your rent, nothing changes outside. Your apartment looks exactly the same as it did the month before. The furniture hasn't moved. The neighbors walk past your door with no idea anything is different. Nobody claps. Nobody notices. The building doesn't know, the street doesn't know, the world continues exactly as it always has, entirely indifferent to what just happened inside your bank account. But inside, something has shifted permanently, in a way that can't be undone simply by forgetting about it. You stop seeing money as something you earn, exclusively, through hours and effort and shown-up mornings. and you start seeing it as something that works quietly on your behalf, whether you're paying attention to it or not, whether you remember it exists on any given Tuesday or not. That's the month freedom quietly introduces itself. Not with fireworks. Not with a Lamborghini pulling into a driveway while neighbors watch through their windows. With a rent payment that left your account exactly on schedule, funded by something other than your paycheck, on a morning that looked in every visible way like every other morning that came before it. And maybe that's the whole point worth carrying forward from this story. Freedom was never going to look like the version culture sells you, loud and photographed and impossible to miss. It looks like silence. It looks like an ordinary Tuesday. It looks like a rent payment that quietly, invisibly stopped needing you at all. Go back, for a moment, to that first morning. The banking app open. Rent already gone. Paycheck still nowhere in sight. And no panic because something else had already handled it. At the time, it probably felt like nothing more than a small technical curiosity, a coincidence of timing between two dates on a calendar. It's only later, looking back, that the moment reveals what it actually was. Not a coincidence. A quiet handoff, years in the making, between a paycheck that had carried your entire life alone, and a second engine that had finally grown strong enough to share the weight. Nobody sends a certificate marking the day that handoff begins. There's no ceremony, no milestone anyone else would recognize, nothing you could point to and say, that was the day. It simply arrives, disguised as an unremarkable morning, indistinguishable from 1,000 mornings before it, except for the small, invisible fact that this time, something other than you had already taken care of things. And once you've experienced that once, genuinely experienced it, not imagined it or read about it happening to someone else, it becomes almost impossible to go back to seeing money the old way. The paycheck illusion, the belief that your labor is the only thing standing between you and collapse, quietly loses its grip, replaced by something steadier, something that doesn't depend entirely on you clocking in every single day for the rest of your life. That's the real ending to this story. Not a number, not a lifestyle, a rent payment, quietly covered, on a morning nobody else will ever remember, except you.